Hello, welcome back to part 2 of our look at the cardiovascular system. And in this video, we're going to be focused on fluid mechanics, and so the physics behind how blood is moving through the arteries and the veins within the cardiovascular system. And much like what we talked about within the heart, the movement of blood is very much based off of, in a sense, pressure gradients. And so when we're talking about fluid mechanics, we really are talking about physics within this. And all of the principles and properties of physics and how a fluid moves through a space is at play here within our arteries and veins. And so we continue to build this understanding of what it means to have this symbiotic relationship between the anatomy, the biochemistry, or the physiology, and this added layer of fluid mechanics, or this added layer of physics, and how the physical properties can go ahead and impact both the anatomy and the physiological responses that are happening. So with that said, let's jump back into this and kind of take a look at this. When we're dealing with fluid mechanics and we're dealing with how blood moves through the arteries, there's really two things that we need to keep in mind. The first thing that we need to keep in mind is this idea of hydrostatic fluid, right, or hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure, or a fluid that is experiencing hydrostatic forces. This is a fluid that is exerting pressure within typically a closed system. Right? And so how much pressure is the fluid exerting on a container, if you would? All right. We measure that fluid within what we define as being millimeters of mercury. And so when you see that unit of measurement of mmHg, mmHg stands for millimeters of mercury. Physiologists very often refer to this idea of hydrostatic fluid as being hydraulic pressure. Right? And that hydraulic pressure is really how we look at how fluid moves through not just a container, but a closed system that changes along the pathway. And so, yes, our cardiovascular system is a closed system. Right? It's on a continuous loop, but it's not like you have a glass or a hose that's not changing diameter. Right? Or having a change in musculature or a change in physical properties. We have a lot of that happens throughout our arterioles down into the capillaries and into the veins. And so how does that change in anatomy really now affect this idea of hydraulic pressure? And so to understand that, right, and to understand how we have, or how this relates to our cardiovascular system, right, what we have up here is a closed system. Right, and so here's a closed system. You have a series of pipes that are all being fed by one supply. Right? And at this end here, it is closed. And so you can see that the pressure here is being exerted equally throughout this system. This is what we refer to as hydrostatic pressure. Right? The pressure remains the same no matter where you are within this system. This is not what we have within the cardiovascular system. Instead, what we have is this idea of hydraulic pressure. All right. So you have this same container, but now we've removed the stopper from this end. And when we remove the stopper from this end, pressure is greatest here. This would be, if you think about this in relationship to the cardiovascular system, all right, pressure is highest here. And so this would be closest to the heart. Right? This would be almost like your aorta. And as you move from your aorta down into your arteries and your arterioles and your veins and your I should say your venules and your veins, what happens to the pressure throughout the cardiovascular system? It drops. It drops. And so while the motion is continuous, the pressure applied to each segment of the system decreases. Right. So think about when you were doing pulse rates, and you did that pulse rate within the carotid, and then you went down to the dorsalis pedis. Right. That pressure was not as strong. Same blood flowing through, but that blood is now moved through aorta, artery, arterioles, and it's now down in the foot, right, within the arterioles of the foot, and so that pressure decreases over a specific distance. Over a specific distance. All right. So what leads to changes within this pressure? Right? What are the factors that can affect the overall change in pressure that would then impact the hydraulic pressure that blood is exerting on the arterioles? Well, we have two factors that we need to look at. The first factor that we need to consider is the heart, because the heart is actually what's doing the pumping. And so this is one factor that we need to consider. And a second factor that we need to consider is what is the environment within the vessels? So what are the vessels experiencing themselves? So within the heart, we need to look at what is the cardiac output, right? How much contractional force is the ventricles exerting on the blood as it is leaving the heart? What's the stroke volume? All right. What's the stroke volume? During contraction, you're going to have higher pressure being exerted on the blood. And of course, during diastole, you're going to have lower pressure exerted on the blood. All right. So with each pump of the heart, how much of that force is being now translated into the blood? That is going to drive hydraulic pressure through the arteries and the arterioles, down into the capillaries, and eventually over into the veins. But the vessels themselves also take an active role in regulating this idea of hydraulic pressure. So, dilation versus constriction. Vasodilation. There's a term that you're going to hear very often. Vasodilation versus vasoconstriction. So in other words, here's your vessel. What is the diameter? Here's your various layers. What's the diameter of that vessel? When the vessel is vasodilated, right, we're experiencing vasodilation, the lumen of that vessel is much wider. And one of the reasons why that happens is to drop the overall pressure being experienced by the vessel from the blood. Right? So it vasodilates, that drops the pressure. But what if it vasoconstricts? Now here's that same vessel, but experiencing vasoconstriction. Vasodilation, vasoconstriction. Whereas vasodilation will drop blood pressure, vasoconstriction very often will increase blood pressure. And by blood pressure, I'm referring to that hydraulic pressure, the pressure exerted on the vessel by the blood as it is flowing through. The other thing that we need to consider there is what is the volume of the blood as well. All right, so by volume, we also then have to take into consideration what we call viscosity, right, or how thick the blood is. So very often, if you're dehydrated, your volume of blood is less, and that means you have a higher viscosity within the blood. The blood is thicker. Right? It's not going to move through the arterial system as easily. And so we can look at this idea of pressure as it relates to we can look at blood flow through the vessel as it relates to pressure. Right? And specifically, the change in pressure that is experienced as the blood is traveling through the vessel. So remember, vessels change in musculature, they change in the presence or the quantity of elastic fibers, and they're also going to change in their ability to vasodilate and vasoconstrict. Right? And so as you change the anatomy of the blood vessel, you're going to change the pressure. And as you change pressure, you change the ability for effective rate of flow or blood flow. And so blood flow is proportional to the change in pressure. And that's exactly what you are seeing right here. Flow is proportional. Flow is proportional to the change in pressure. All right. So what is the pressure within the vessel at the initial? What is the pressure within the vessel at the end? Right? And the change in that pressure is going to tell you whether or not the rate of flow of blood is going to increase or decrease. And so as pressure increases, flow increases. As pressure decreases, flow decreases. So what would cause an increase in pressure? Well, as the blood is going through a particular vessel, artery, if you've got vasoconstriction, increase in pressure, increase the flow. All right, because the amount of force being applied back onto the blood is going to increase, and that's going to propel the blood. If you're going to decrease that pressure, so in other words, if you're experiencing vasodilation, then that's going to drop very often the rate of blood flow. All right, so again, flow is proportional to the change in pressure. Now, this is assuming that your blood volume stays the same. All right, so let's look at it from this perspective. You start you're at a lake, you're getting ready to start running. All right, you start running, what ends up happening? Well, your stroke volume goes up, which means cardiac output goes up, which means your blood volume goes up. Your blood vessels have to adjust to that, and so what they will do is to not over increase the pressure within the arterioles. They vasodilate, but that's helping to maintain the blood pressure. Why? Because you've increased volume. So when you increase volume, you have to increase, yes, that's right, you have to increase the radius of the artery to be able to maintain that pressure gradient. So again, everything is still proportional. Flow is still proportional to the change of pressure. Right? As that blood is now, as your volume is increasing, as you go from point A to point B in the vasculature, you're going to see vasodilation in order to support and maintain pressure within the system. Right? And so that is pretty much, these are just some examples of what you are seeing here as far as pressure gradients. And so for this example right here, you have blood flow that's coming into a vessel. You start out at 100 millimeters of mercury pressure within the vessel, and nothing changes. And so therefore you do not have an increase or decrease in the rate of flow. All right. With this particular vessel, you have 100 millimeters of mercury initial. Right, but you're ending at 75 millimeters of mercury, and so that's a change in pressure of 25 millimeters of mercury. All right, so in this case, what's going to happen? Yeah, your pressure has changed, it's decreased, which means your rate of flow is also going to decrease because you've got less pressure that is now pushing behind the blood. What would cause this? Right? What would cause a decrease in pressure? Vasodilation would cause that. Or the other thing that would cause that decrease in pressure might be a reduction in cardiac output. Right, so stroke volume decreases. And that's also going to then affect the overall pressure. And so there's some different scenarios here that can cause this decrease. Right, so again, what's causing this decrease here, because this one here is also decreasing as well, what's causing this decrease can be vasodilation, a decrease in cardiac output or stroke volume. Right? Both of these things here will lead to that decrease. If you're decreasing cardiac output and stroke volume, you're also decreasing the overall blood volume as well. Now, we can take this a step further and not only say that that there is a relationship between, a proportional relationship between the rate of flow and pressure, but we also need to consider what are the forces that are working against flow. What are forces that are working against that pressure that's forcing the cardiovascular system to constantly be adjusting the diameter and the pressure found within the arterial system? Well, that's resistance. All right, and so this idea of resistance is always working to try to slow down the rate of blood flow. And so resistance is against the idea or the notion of flow. So flow is proportional to 1 over R, right? Or flow is improportional to resistance. Right? It goes against, or inversely proportional is the term that we typically use. And so for this, when we add in the factor of resistance, right, flow is inversely proportional to resistance. Right? Flow is inversely proportional to resistance. Resistance is anything that is going to act as a drag, or it's going to slow down that rate of flow. Right? And so, what could slow down the rate of flow? Well, there's 3 factors that will affect resistance: the length of the vessel. So, in other words, the longer the blood is flowing through the system, the tendency is for it to slow down. Why? Because of friction. All right, you've got fibrinogen, you've got cells, red blood cells, erythrocytes, you've got leukocytes, you've got all these various things that are now scratching and scraping against the inside of the lumen of the arterioles. That's going to create resistance. It's going to force it to slow down. Right? Viscosity of the blood. How thick is the blood? Right? What is the blood volume? Is there a lot of water? All right. Or is there not? Or are you dehydrated and therefore that blood is thicker? Right? That will affect resistance. The higher the viscosity, the more resistance you're going to experience. And the radius of the vessel. Right? What's the diameter or the radius of the vessel? Is the vessel experiencing vasoconstriction or vasodilation, or is the vessel just relaxed and in a normal state? And so those 3 factors have the greatest impact on resistance. Now, Poiseuille was a French anatomist, and he developed this idea of Poiseuille's law that looked at what were the factors that were truly at play when we look at resistance. Right? And so his initial law was that resistance is proportional to L mu divided by R to the 4th, right? Where L equals the length, right? So resistance increases as the length increases. Mu, right, or that little n there that you see there, is viscosity, and so resistance once again increases as viscosity increases, and then R is radius. And so resistance is going to decrease as radius increases, or resistance increases as the radius decreases. But two of those three really don't change much because of either the anatomy or homeostasis within an adult. Right? Length of our vessels don't really change once you're an adult. Right? They do when you're growing as an adolescent or a child or an infant, absolutely. But once you've reached adulthood, the length of your vessels aren't really changing too much. You're not growing anymore. They don't need to add or shorten any. It is what it is. All right. Viscosity really doesn't change much either because, as we will find out, there is this interplay between the urinary system and the cardiovascular system that maintains a relatively stable viscosity or blood volume. And so viscosity doesn't really change either within the norm. But we are left with radius. And we know that vessels are constantly vasoconstricting and constantly vasodilating. And so when we look at Poiseuille's law, we really basically just ignore the L and the mu. All right? We ignore that. We ignore the impacts of length on resistance, and we ignore the impact of viscosity on resistance because they're negligible at best. But what really impacts resistance is R. And so when we take that into account, Poiseuille's law is really saying that resistance is proportional to 1 over the radius to the fourth. Right? Resistance is proportional to 1 over R to the fourth. What does that mean? What does that look like? Well, what that looks like is what you're seeing right here. All right. Just taking into account the radius, because remember, viscosity and vessel length again is negligible at best. All right. And so when we look at this idea of resistance, all right, look at our picture that's right here. All right. Here's vessel 1. Here's vessel 2. All right. Same pressure is coming into each vessel. Same pressure is coming into each vessel. Right? The radius in vessel 2 is 2 times the radius of vessel 1. Right? So vessel 1, for argument's sake, vessel 1 is 1 millimeter in diameter, and vessel 2 is 2 times that, and it's 2 millimeters in diameter. I'm just making this argument for argument's sake. All right. So the resistance in vessel 2 is 1/16 that of vessel 1. Right? Why? Because 1 over R to the fourth. 1 over 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. And so this is 1/16. All right. Resistance in vessel 2 is 1/16 that of what it would be in vessel 1. All right, because 1 to 1 to the fourth, which is basically 1 times 1 times 1 times 1. 1 times 1 is 1, times 1 is 1, times 1 is 1. 1 over 1 is 1. All right. And so your resistance in vessel 2 is much, 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 much less. Right? Flow, the other way of thinking about this is flow in vessel 2 is 16 times greater than in vessel 1. You have 16 times the rate of flow in vessel 2 because the resistance is 1/16. Right? So think about it. You'd have 16 slices. You take 1 away. That 1 away equaled the resistance. Everything else is flow. Everything else is flow. And so that is what you're seeing here on this slide. All right. Apply this to straws. I like milkshakes, so let's talk about straws. A straw with a radius of 1 is 1 over 1 to the fourth, which it's 1. It's a resistance of 1. It's a high rate of resistance. Your flow is going to be much slower. Your flow in that case is really only going to be 1/16. Your rate of flow is really only 1/16. That's a trickle. Whereas the straw with a radius of 2 is going to be 1/16, and so your resistance is only 1/16, or your rate of flow is 16 times more. than with a radius of 1. And again, there's that idea of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And so we're going to stop there and let you kind of mull that over and try to get a good grasp on what is the impact of resistance on the rate of flow within our blood. What is the impact or the relationship between a change in that pressure and the rate of flow? And so they're the two key concepts that you want to take away from this video. With that said, we're going to leave you to kind of review some of these questions, and I'll catch you on the flip side.